Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of The Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined again by Dr. Christian Miller. He is the AC Reid Professor of Philosophy at Wake Forest University. So, in our previous conversation, we talked about his book, Honesty and the Virtue of Honesty, and today we're going to be doing the same but focusing on generosity and patience this time. So, Christian, welcome back to the show. It's always a
Thank,
pleasure to have you on.
thanks for having me back. I'm really looking forward to it again.
Okay, so let's start with the virtue of generosity. And I'm really interested in getting into this kind of topic because, as we talked about last time, or at least it was one of the topics we covered, it seems that the virtues have been neglected in philosophy for one reason or the other. We're not sure what's the specific reason for that. But anyway, how would you define generosity yourself?
Sure. So you're right to first say that there are certain virtues that have been neglected in philosophy. Generosity has not been discussed very much in the last 50 years. There are almost no articles. And then the other one we're going to talk about, patience, is the same way. So for generosity, I'm thinking of this as the virtue of generosity. I want to be clear up front. There's other things we could be talking about. Maybe we will talk about, like generous actions, but we're talking first and foremost about what it is to be a generous person. A generous person has the virtue of generosity. The virtue of generosity, it has multiple facets to it. It needs to be exercised cross-situationally, which means that it can't just be generosity with respect to one kind of action. It needs to be generosity in this situation, generosity in this situation, generosity in this situation that are relevant to generosity. Needs to be stable over time. So it's not just that you're generous one day and never again, or generous just on Tuesdays and not any other day of the week. It needs to be reliably stable from day to day, week to week, month to month. Now, that's true of all virtues. So what about generosity in particular? Well, there are a couple of things here. One is it involves a willingness to give to others something that is of value to yourself. These kind of things I think we're going to unpack more in detail, so I'll just say them briefly. So the first aspect of it is a willingness and an actual behavior of giving to others something that is valuable to yourself, that you see of value to yourself, from the right kind of reasons or motivation. So virtues involve appropriate motivation and behavior, and so we'll have to unpack what that appropriate motivation looks like. And then in cases where you're not required to do so. So if you're required to perform a helpful action, for example, then that would not be generous. Generous actions are ones which are gifts. They are going above and beyond the call of duty. So to summarize it, giving something to others when you're not required to do something, not required to do so, that something is of value to you and you're doing it for the right reasons.
And could you give us some examples of behaviors that would exemplify the virtue of generosity?
Sure. So the standard go-to would be money. And so you're generous with your money. You give money to other people who are in need. Maybe you make a donation to a charity of $1,000. That's a very generous donation to that charity or to the symphony or to the school or whatever it might be. I think it's important to note, though, that generosity is not limited just to monetary donations. You can be said to be generous with your time.
Yeah.
I try to live up to that as a professor. I try to be generous with my time when it comes to my students who need extra help, for example, in the class. You can be generous with other things, too. You can be generous with resources. You can be generous with opportunities. Lots of things you can be generous with, although we tend to gravitate towards time and money as the paradigm examples.
Right. And I mean, in one of the articles you wrote on generosity, I found that a very interesting bit of it was that you, at a certain point, distinguish or try to distinguish between what would be a generous action, acting from generosity or out of generosity, and being a generous person. So I think we've talked a little bit about this sort of distinction last time when we talked about honesty. But why do you think it's important to establish this distinction?
Yeah. So this is sometimes where people roll their eyes like, oh, a philosopher's up to, up to no good here, making all these distinctions. And does it really matter? And how do I keep track of them? So I think it does matter. And let's go one by one. So a generous action in isolation is just a description of that action. Mm-hmm. So it could be, writing the check for $1,000 to the charity. Mm-hmm. By itself, that doesn't tell you why the action was done. Right. And it doesn't tell you anything about the character of the person. So it could be, for all you know, just seeing this generous action, that the person is not generous and did not have good motivating reasons for doing the action. Or they could have. They could be. It's undetermined. It's unknown. So to make this flesh it out a little bit, it could be that they're donating that $1,000 just for the tax benefit. Or just
then, let me just ask you this then. But then you would be willing to classify an isolated action as generous, even though we end up finding out that the person who performed that isolated action is not a generous person at all, for example?
I would be, and that's controversial. Maybe others won't like to do that. But all I'm meaning here is, by generous action, is an action that a generous person would perform.
Right.
So the same kind of action that a generous person would perform, but doesn't have to be performed by a generous person. Mm-hmm. So in this circumstance, I would expect a generous person to perform that action.
Right.
That's a generous action. But it could be performed by anyone. Mm-hmm. Same thing with other virtues. An honest action. I tell the truth here right now. That's an honest action. Why? Well, it's just the action I would expect an honest person to tell. Mm-hmm. But whether I'm honest or not, that remains to be seen. So let's just stipulate it that way. That is, it's just that kind of action that you would expect a generous person to perform. So that's different from acting from generosity.
Okay.
So the acting from generosity means you have to be generous in the first place. To act from generosity, you have to possess the virtue to perform actions from it. And so if I learn that this person's acting from generosity in making the $1,000 donation, then I know more about that person. I know, or I have to know, to claim that accurately, I have to know that that person is generous in the first place. Mm-hmm. And then the last one, being generous or having the virtue of generosity, well, that's a description of the person. Now we're making a person-level ascription. We're talking about who this person is in general. This person has, as part of their psychology, a virtue of generosity, which disposes them to think, feel, and act in generous ways. Mm-hmm. And so this is when that cross-situational consistency will come in. It'll manifest in a variety of situations. It'll be stable over time, done for the right reasons. It's quite a multifaceted and sophisticated kind of thing to have the virtue of generosity. So to sum it up, just a one-off generous action can be done by anyone. Mm-hmm. That action being an action from generosity cannot be done by anyone. It can only be done by a generous person. Mm-hmm. And a generous person is someone who has the virtue of generosity, which manifests not just in that action, but in a variety of other actions over time and across situations.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's try to break down generosity a little bit more in terms of what it means for an action to be generous, and also let's say the more psychological side of things. What are the correct motivations or intentions behind an action, for example? So do generous actions need to be always necessarily costly to the person who's performing the action?
I think so. And now we'll get into some details of my own view, which not everyone will accept, of course, and there'll be in philosophy, endless challenges. But that's what I'm putting forward. I'm putting forward the claim, first of all, that in order for an action to be generous, now acting from generosity, coming from the virtue of generosity, it needs to be one that is costly to the person who's donating or giving the thing in question. Now, that is ambiguous. Is it costly in their eyes, or is it costly objectively speaking? Or both, maybe.
Yeah.
So many times I think it'll be both. So, go back to the example again, $1,000, that's going to be costly in my eyes. That's a lot of money for me. And objectively, it would be costly to give to someone else. But that's not always the case. So imagine a person who has maybe a child who has a collection of shells or a collection of sticks or something like that. And to them, it's very important. They treasure it. They really care a lot about it. But for whatever reason, they want to help someone else out. They see a call for help, for disaster relief, and they decide to donate their personally treasured valuables. Objectively, these things are not worth anything. They're not going to help out anyone in need, but subjectively, they're very important to the person. I think in that kind of case, they're still being generous. So I have the intuition that that's a generous action. And so what that leads me to think is that it's costly. What matters is being costly in the eyes of the donor, what they personally think is important. Whether that's objectively important or not is a separate matter and not so important for generosity.
But, just to try to understand a little bit better what it means to be, for something to be costly to someone. So, for example, let's say that we're talking about a billionaire. Someone who has more than $1 billion and they donate to charity, I don't know, $1 million. It's a huge amount of money, but for them, perhaps it doesn't make a big difference. But could we still say that it's generous just because it's such a big amount of money, for example?
Yeah, that's a tough case for me. And I think many people would say, oh, that was a very generous donation on the part of that billionaire. But maybe they say that just because they read about it in the newspaper and they see the amount of money. If we probe deeper into the psychology of the billionaire, and we find out that the billionaire didn't, for that person, $1 million is trivial, doesn't matter. They don't miss it at all. It's like, drop in the ocean. Then I want to say, well, wait a minute. Glad you did this. It's a good action. I praise you for it, but generous is something else, and it's not generous. So we can adjust the money however we like and maybe get to the same point. So, make it myself, I'm definitely not a billionaire nor a millionaire, and make it a penny, U.S. dollar, in U.S. money. So now, relative, it's proportional to my money, and a penny, and I say, okay, I donate a penny. Well, it's better than donating nothing. On the other hand, was it generous? Well, I don't really care about pennies. I don't even stop to pick them up off the ground anymore. So I think it's hard to say that it was a generous action, on my way of thinking. Same too with the billionaire.
And in that particular case, perhaps we can introduce here questions regarding intention and motivation, because let's say that in that particular case, sticking with the example of the billionaire, we end up finding that that person gave out $1 million to charity because they were not really motivated by generosity, but they just wanted to see their name out there, or perhaps to whitewash some of their other nefarious activities, let's say. So I guess that you wouldn't say that counts as generous.
Correct. Yeah, you kind of already helped me out here, right? So I think this couple points. First of all, it reinforces why motivation matters.
Yeah.
and this is true for all virtues, motivation matters. External behavior is, even no matter how good it is not sufficient for being a virtuous person. In this case, while the person donated $1 million, let's say now, let's make the example one where $1 million does matter to them.
Mm-hmm.
That is something that's costly to them.
Okay.
Does it qualify, therefore, as generous? No, not until we know what the motivation is. And if it's an egoistic motivation, if it's just to benefit the donor, say like in your examples, or for the tax benefits or whatever other purely self-interested motivation there might be, then that's going to fail the second requirement for generosity. Now that invites the question, well, what would be a virtuous kind of motivation? What would be a good way to donate $1 million? And here I want to distinguish different types of motivation. Egoistic, that's benefiting just yourself. Your goal is to benefit yourself, and others are kind of, your actions are instrumental to that.
Mm-hmm.
Dutiful motivation, that has to do with doing your duty, doing the right thing, doing what morality requires. In Kant's language, doing it because it's the right thing to do. I don't think that applies in the case of generosity. I don't think if that was the motivation, we would think that that's a generous kind of motivation. The third category is what applies in the case of generosity, and that is altruistic motivation. Motivation aimed at benefiting others for their own sake. So if the billionaire is generously donating the $1 million, they care about that $1 million, and they're motivated to make the donation because they want to alleviate the suffering of those in need. Or they want to improve the situation of those who are being persecuted, or whatever it might be. Not so that they can reap benefits for themselves, the donor, but so that the people in need can benefit. Now, one last caveat about that. Always want to remember that when you're altruistically motivated and you perform a generous action, you can benefit. It's not like it's completely selfless. You never get any benefit from it.
Mm-hmm.
But if you do benefit, that's as a side effect or a byproduct.
Okay.
It's not your goal. Your goal is not to benefit yourself. Your goal is to help the people in need. And if it so happens that as a result, say you get some publicity or you get some recognition, that's maybe nice, but that's not what you're aiming for. It's a side effect or byproduct.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, perhaps putting things the other way around, because I was talking about a huge sum of money. So let's say that we have the opposite, someone who is very poor, or even in the worst case scenario, homeless, for example, and they have, I don't know, $5 in their pocket. And even though they are starving and they need to eat, they see, for example, a small child on the street and they think to themselves, okay, so I mean, even if I'm hungry, I will still give these last $5 I have to that child because she probably needs it more than I do, and I can go for a few more days without eating. I mean, that's, I guess, an example of someone who is extremely selfless, and in that specific case, it's just $5 and it's just perhaps helping a little bit one single person, but it's perhaps a more generous act than giving out $1 million with bad motivations behind the donation that could still help many more people.
Correct? Yep. That's very nice. You summarized exactly how I think of it too. I wouldn't even count the $1 million donation you described as a generous act at all. Mm-hmm. Now, let's use the terminology right, as acting from generosity at all. Acting from generosity means you need to have the right kind of motivation. There's not the right kind of motivation, so it doesn't even qualify as acting from generosity. Yeah. In your first example, though, that's just, I think, a paradigm or exemplary case of generosity. I think generosity can come in degrees, and some actions are more generous than others, and some people are more generous than others. And in this case, even though the amount is objectively small, I don't think that matters. I think what matters is, look, in this particular situation, it's extremely impactful and it's extremely sacrificial on the part of the donor, and the donation is made for the best motivation there is, out of care and concern and love for another human being. So if you want to go to look at exemplary forms of generosity, you don't need to always go to the attention grabbing, the flashy ones. Sometimes the small, really powerful examples are the best.
Mm-hmm. And does it matter if you give out something that the recipient doesn't really need? Does that make a difference?
It does in some ways, and it doesn't in others. It matters to the recipients, of course.
Yeah.
So it matters to that person, and it matters to the kind of overall good consequences that are promoted in the world. So for utilitarians, and we're thinking about trying to make the world a better place, and that's all that matters. It matters from that perspective. But does it matter from the perspective of generosity, the virtue of generosity? And I want to say no. And this is another controversial element of the proposal, because some people would push back at this. I would say, look, if your intentions are good and it's costly to you, and you make the actual donation, then even if it doesn't benefit the other person, you're still doing something that's generous. Let me give an example that I think has helped convince me that this is the right way to go. I don't know if it'll convince other people, but it's convinced me. So take a farmer who has had a big crop this year and has some extra left over. And so the farmer is wondering what to do with it. And the farmer ends up donating the crop to a local food bank where people in need can come who don't have any food and get food for free. Mm-hmm. Now, unbeknownst to the farmer, before the donation was made, that extra crop got infected with a microscopic parasite. Right. So the farmer had no way of knowing this, couldn't see it, didn't do anything wrong, took all the usual precautions, was completely blameless. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, because of that parasite, the people who come to the food bank get sick. They don't die, but they get very sick from the food, and so they're actually worse off than they were if they hadn't eaten the food. My intuition here is to say that's still a generous action on the part of the farmer. And it meets the conditions we've talked about so far. It's costly to the farmer. Yeah. It's motivated by the right kind of reasons, altruistic. The farmer wants to help out these people. Right. Nevertheless, they're not actually benefited. Mm-hmm. They're made worse off, unintentionally and blamelessly, but still worse off. I think still generous, even in that case.
So the way you're approaching things here, consequences don't matter that much.
That's right. Yep. So you can think about virtue from a variety of perspectives, and this is when I answer this question, I'm kind of answering from the perspective of virtues in general, not just generosity. I think it's true for all the virtues. Some people think about virtues in terms only of the consequences. So in order for something to be a virtue, it has to produce good consequences. And if it doesn't, then doesn't even qualify. The opposite perspective is to say, no, it's all a matter of motivation and intention. And so long as you check the boxes there, you meet the qualifications there, then even if the trait doesn't produce good consequences, that's okay. And so that's an active debate in thinking about virtues in general. And I clearly side with the second position, the one about motivation and intention, which is that's the most popular position. It goes all the way back to Aristotle. It has a long tradition in Western philosophy. And today, most people who work on virtue also hold that position. So I'm not an outlier. I'm I would say more of the mainstream position, but it's still not universally held. So.
Right. So talking about another aspect of generosity, let's say, or generous actions, does it matter if they are done freely or if they are in some way coerced? And of course, let's not get into what free will means or what is a free action, because I guess that falls a little bit outside of the scope of this discussion. But let's just assume that we agree on what it means for an action to be freely performed. So does that matter or not?
Yes. Matters in two ways. So there's the straightforward free will discussion, and then there's a special aspect here with respect to generosity. So we could have a general, kind of straightforward free will discussion about all virtues, whether free will matters. Then we'd have to get into things like, is praise and blame connected to free will? So do you have to have free will in order to be praiseworthy and blameworthy? If so, and if you think that virtues are praiseworthy, then you're going to think free will is necessary. I think all that's true, though. So I do think free will is necessary here. Necessary in the acquisition of a virtue and necessary in the exercise of a virtue, actually, employing it or deploying it in a particular situation. So that's kind of generic stuff. There's a special interesting wrinkle, though, in the case of generosity, and that has to do with whether generous actions are morally required. So you're expected to perform them, or whether they are free in the sense of they're optional. You have the option of performing them or not performing them, and morality gives you that freedom. So that sense of freedom is what I'm going to talk about now. So this is what philosophers call the supererogatory, to use a very fancy technical term, the supererogatory, which means going above and beyond the call of duty. So let's unpack that a little bit more. So let's just leave aside generosity for the moment. Let's take an example of a rescue situation. So a house is burning. It's on fire. It's burning actively. There's a child who's trapped in the house. You're walking by. You're not a firefighter, but you see the child trapped in the house. What should you make of that? Well, most people would say you're not morally required to run into the house. Not everyone would say that, but most people would say that. But it's supererogatory. It's above and beyond the call of duty. If you choose to do it and you save the child, that's very commendable, very praiseworthy, extraordinary. We laud you and celebrate you for doing that. If you don't go into the house, though, that's, morality gives you that freedom too. You're not going to be condemned or blamed because, look, it's an extraordinary situation. So we come back to generosity then. Would we think of generous actions more like moral requirements or more like supererogatory freedoms? And I want to say they're more like supererogatory freedoms. They are things that you're not required to do. You have the option of doing them or not doing them. If you do them, though, they're highly praiseworthy. And that, independent of the magnitude, like we talked about before, $5 to that child, that person who's already homeless didn't have to do that. They could have kept that $5. They chose of their own free will to go that way, and they did a supererogatory action, which is highly praiseworthy. So that's how I think of the last point on that is this relates to generosity as gifts, giving. So I think of generous actions as a kind of gift that's being given to someone else, and gifts by their very nature aren't required. Gifts are freely given, not obligated. If they're obligated, they're no longer gifts. And generous actions are gifts.
Right. So with all of that in mind, when can we really say that someone possesses the virtue of generosity? Would you have a set of criteria to determine that?
Well, I think there are objective criteria, and we've been talking about that. That's what our interview has been about so far. Kind of objectively speaking, from a God's eye perspective, or from a fully informed perspective, what are the criteria you have to meet in order to count as a generous person? But this question is more epistemic. It's more like, how do I tell if I, meet someone for the first time, or if I'm thinking about my friends. How can I tell? What kind of checklist should I go through in my mind to discern whether they're generous or not? Mm-hmm. And I think we can use the same criteria, but we have to be very thoughtful about doing it. So, for example, take a friend. I see my friend spend a lot of extra time helping another friend with their homework. Mm. And I say, oh, that's a generous action. You're being quite generous with that other friend in helping with your time and helping that friend with the homework. But I cannot conclude from that that's a generous person. We have to think about the features of generosity. We have to then observe that friend in other situations. Are they also generous with their money? Are they also generous with their time in other ways besides with their friends and homework? So we have to look at the cross-situational consistency. We have to look over time. Am I seeing a pattern of over time of being exhibiting generosity? Do I see them giving something that's costly to themselves? Or maybe these are just people who, for them, their time is not very costly, or their money is not very costly to give away. So we have to check that box. The hardest one here is going to be the motivation. Mm-hmm. No surprise, right? It's one thing to observe someone's behavior. It's another thing to be able to kind of look into their minds and figure out why they did what they did. We can ask them, of course. We can say, well, why did you do that? Why did you, you had a lot going on too. Why did you spend that so much time with our friends and their homework? And they might say, well, look, I just care about that person. I didn't want to see that person fail the test. So we can kind of get at motivation maybe by asking, but of course that's not completely reliable. People don't always know what their motivations are. You can be blind to some of your unconscious motivations.
Right.
And of course people can rationalize their motivations too. They can make them look better than they really were. So there's all by way of saying there's some things we can do, but there's nothing we can do super reliably. That will kind of give us a checklist. And if we go down the checklist, then we just know the answer. We're going to have to make rough approximations, I think.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, and I guess that we got into this issue last time when we talked about honesty, but can we really evaluate the virtues, not just generosity, but all the other virtues quantitatively? I mean, for example, if someone, of course, I don't think that we can do this ever, but let's say that we were able to track the behavior of someone across their lifespan and they were generous like 70, 80% of the time. I mean, does that matter? Is that, can we do it quantitatively, or is it's just a qualitative approach, let's say? I mean, if someone fails 30% of the time, are they not a generous person? Or
so two parts to the question. One is just what do we think about this hypothetical example, and then secondly, what can we actually do since we can't do that hypothetical example?
Right.
So in the hypothetical example, yes, I think you can call someone generous accurately, even though they're not generous in every single situation. Mm-hmm. And to be generous in every single situation would be an extremely high bar that none of us would ever meet, and so none of us would ever qualify as generous. Right. I think the way to think about it is, like all virtues, generosity comes in degrees. Mm-hmm. Some people are more generous than others.
Right.
And so it's not a matter of 100% or 0. And if you fail the 100%, therefore you're not generous at all. It's a matter of where on the spectrum does this person fall. And I would say, look, I mean, if someone is generous 70% of the time when they have the opportunity to be generous, that's extraordinary. That's tremendous. I would be, sign me up. As far as we know, now we don't know the motivation yet, but as far as we know, that sign me up for calling that person generous. And let's use that person as an exemplar and as someone we should role model, as a role model for us that we should try to follow in our lives. Now, what about reality? reality when it comes to measurement is not like that, because we can't track people across their lives and
Of
see
course.
how often they were generous or not. So what can we do? Well, we can do some things which are pale comparisons of that. We can broadly two types of things. One, we can administer surveys and survey people, not just the target, but we can also survey the target's friends. We can survey the target's family members, get some observer reports as well about the target, as well as survey the target him or herself with a sophisticated questionnaire, not like rate how generous you are, 1 to 5. That's silly, but a more sophisticated, multifaceted questionnaire. We can do that, and that I think has some value, especially when you bring in other perspectives and multiple perspectives, and see if those multiple perspectives all coincide or correlate with each other. And then, secondly, we can do some behavioral tests, but they're typically going to be one-off behavioral tests. So we're going to bring someone into the lab, and then we'll do one activity to measure their generosity. For example, a dictator game. In dictator games, you give the person a certain amount of money, and then you say, look, you have the opportunity to share this money with someone else. Say it's $10. You could keep the $10 entirely yourself, or you could share the $10 with someone else. You get to decide, and then we see what the person does. And then there are plenty of dictator studies. We can talk about those. But the point being that, okay, whatever they do there, that's just a one-off measure of one situation where they could be generous.
And by the way, since we're talking about empirical work or a more empirical approach to things here, have people done or been doing any empirical work on generosity? Do we know how generous people tend to be?
Yeah, so I don't know. I've not actually gotten into this extensively, so I'm going to really hedge on this. And again, it would depend on what kind of empirical work we're looking for. So, take the categories I just have. Survey research, yes, there is some survey research. Behavioral research, yes, there is some behavioral research. So maybe I'll pick up the thread again with the behavioral research. So dictator games were not, used normally with generosity in mind, but they can be adapted to thinking about generosity. So I'll give you a couple just quick results from those. So in one of the classic studies, again, the setup is a participant's given $10 and then has the option to share it with someone else or not. That fits a generous setup, a situation, because it's optional. They don't have to give the $10. There's questions about motivation, and it would be costly to them, typically, to give the $10 or some part of the $10 to someone else. So what happened in one of the classic studies, this is by Forsyth, 79% gave something, 21% gave nothing, and of the 79%, 21% gave an equal amount. So that's one result. Dan Kahneman, who's a very famous psychologist and economist, has another classic study in this area. So here it was $20, and you could either keep the $20 entirely for themselves, or divide it up.
Right.
And in this kind of situation, they chose 76% of the time an even division. And so what does this suggest? Well, I mean, look, let's not get carried away. These are only two studies, and we shouldn't generalize beyond that. But just a little bit of evidence suggests that in this particular situation, people are willing to be generous with their money to some extent. However, it's very artificial. This is a lab with kind of expectations built into it that, if you come into this lab, we're probably interested in what you do with this money, and we're probably expecting you to do something with the money. So it's maybe not very real world. And to give you one last study here, by way of illustrating that point, Winkin and Miser in 2013, and here I'm just going to read something I wrote about this, kind of summarizing the study. This was in a real world environment in Las Vegas, or I don't know if Las Vegas is the real world or not, but that's a side point. They had a Confederate, so an actor, approach an individual at a bus stop. And here's what they said. He pretended to notice chips in his pocket, stopped briefly and claimed to the participant that he was late for a ride to the airport, and asked the individual if he or she wanted the casino chips, which he did not have time to cash in. And so the participant would take the chips, and then this actor would say, look, over there, there's someone else. I don't know, you can split it with that guy however you want, while pointing to a second actor. So this is real world. The participants don't know that they're participants. They don't know that these are actors. They're just, meeting the stranger who's giving them the casino chips and then noting, oh, there's someone else over there. Maybe you want to share those casino chips. What happened? Every single participant kept all the casino chips for themselves. Not one of them shared the chips. So in that particular real world study, that did not reflect so well on the generosity of the participants. So that's just a little bit of sampling of the empirical evidence.
Okay, so getting into patients, could you give us some examples of situations where we would have an opportunity to exercise patience?
Sure. So this is a kind of a big shift now. We're going from one neglected virtue to another neglected virtue. In philosophy, both of these have received little attention, and they're not clearly intertwined with each other. So it's really like two separate virtues we're going to be talking about here. However, I think here's something they have in common. They're both really important, and they both matter a lot. And so I want to do what I can to bring more attention to them and get more people talking about them. So to now start on patience, I think we can quickly think of plenty of situations where we exhibit patience, or maybe the opposite, impatience. Probably comes to mind even easier. But let's put a couple on the table here. Here's one, waiting in the supermarket to check out, and the person who's checking out the groceries is taking a very long time, is very slow. And so you're waiting in line a really long time. Similar in the U.S., this is a phenomenon that many people would relate to. The Department of Motor Vehicles is notoriously slow when you're getting a driver's license, and you have to wait forever, and people get very impatient in line. Another kind of situation, on the phone. When you're talking to the phone company or the TV company or whatever the case might be, and they put you on hold. That can be a situation which tests your patience. And I'll mention one last one, traffic jams. I don't know where it's like where you are, but look, in big cities in the U.S., you can count on being stuck in traffic sometimes an hour or two if it's rush hour and the traffic's really bad. And so that's an opportunity that tests your patience or not.
Okay, so talking then about, as we did for generosity, some of the aspects we have to pay attention to really determine if someone is patient or not. What should we think about goals and time in the context of patience?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's really at the heart of patience and impatience. So let's maybe center it around one of the examples. I'm stuck in traffic and I get impatient. What's going on? Well, I have a goal. I want to get home. And not just home eventually, like this week, I want to get home soon. And it's taking me longer than I had wanted to get home. Because of the traffic jam. So my goal is being frustrated. I have this goal of getting home quickly, and I cannot meet my goal because of the traffic jam, and so I get frustrated. And that's a kind of mark of impatience.
Right.
Let's change the example. I want to get to the party. Bring my family to the party. The party's about to start. I don't want to be late for the party. But my family's taking a long time getting out the door. All of a sudden, I can't find my shoes, and I gotta go to the bathroom, and my hair's a mess, and and I'm getting impatient because I've got this goal of getting the party in time, and it's looking like I'm not going to be able to meet that goal. My progress towards achieving the goal is going slower than I had hoped it would be. Mm-hmm. So that's at the kind of heart of patience and impatience.
And psychologically speaking, would you associate particular emotions with the virtue of patience?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So that's already come out in the examples. Now of patience and impatience. Mm-hmm. So it's sometimes easier in my mind to start with impatience because I don't know, maybe it's just personal because I can, connect to it a little bit more. It's maybe more vivid and charged. So emotions associated with impatience typically are things like frustration and anger. The person who gets angry in the traffic jam and starts saying bad words or honking on the horn or whatnot. Mm-hmm. Their impatience is manifesting because they're feeling an emotion of anger in response to the situation they're in. Frustration works the same way. There are other ones, though, that come up in the context of impatience. Wanting things anticipation, wanting things to happen faster than they are. So this is maybe a less standard example, but you're going to win an award, and you're waiting for them to call you up to win an award, and it's taking forever, and the speaker is droning on and on and on, and so you're losing your patience. You're not angry, but you're losing your patience in anticipation of something really good. Mm-hmm. Now, let's go to the virtue finally. Flip it around. Well, what is the emotional life of a patient person like? Well, I think there's one answer here, and it's pretty much everyone gives the same answer, and I think it's the right answer, which is calmness. Right. A patient person is calm in the face of delays in achieving their goals. So in the traffic jam, in the line at the grocery store, they react to those situations calmly as opposed to with anger or frustration. So that's where I think we want to put the emotional focus when it comes to a patient person.
Mm-hmm. And we talked about motivation in the case of generosity. Does it also matter in the particular case of patience?
Yeah, I think it does. And that follows both from just my general stance that for all virtues it matters. So if patience is going to be a virtue, it's got to matter there too. So just follows my kind of general outlook and most people's general outlook about virtues. But I think it also is intuitive in the case of patience. So even if you didn't believe me for other virtues, I think you might believe me in this case. So let's take, I like to use a lot of examples to make it less abstract. Let's go back to the waiting in line example. Mm-hmm. Now here we're thinking about behavior that's patient behavior using our distinctions from earlier. And then we're wondering, what about the motivation? So the line is long, the checkout person is struggling, they're just going very slowly, but you're in line and you're not exhibiting any impatient behavior. You're not like sighing or tapping your foot or like, saying mean words to the other people in line. Mm-hmm. Now we ask, okay, so you're acting quite calmly. Why? Well, there could be a variety of answers. Maybe your answer is, look, I just feel sorry for that person. She's doing the best she can. It's not her fault. Mm-hmm. Or, look, if I were in that situation, I wouldn't have done any better. Yeah. Or how would you feel if the people in line were mean to you? You wouldn't feel very good. So I'm not going to, be mean to this person. all these kind of reasons, they're quite admirable reasons. I think they're great. They're reasons of care and concern and fairness and justice and so forth. However, there are some reasons I wouldn't think were great and would not be exhibiting the virtue of patience. Like, well, I'm only being calm because I hope to ask this person out on a date. That's why. Or I'm only being calm because, well, I'm on my phone the whole time. I didn't even notice the line. Or I'm only being calm because I don't want other people to criticize me for being impatient. Those more self-interested reasons, once again, comes just like with the case of honesty and the case of generosity and the case of other virtues, those self-interested reasons don't count. So motivation matters.
But when it comes to some of the motivations you pointed there as examples, perhaps that gets us into another issue. That is, so when it comes to distinguishing between the different virtues, for example, at a certain point there you gave us an example, so I'm standing in line here patiently because I feel sorry for the person in front of me because they need to take their time to do their stuff and all of that. So isn't that more perhaps compassion than patience? I mean, isn't that an issue that perhaps that is referring not exactly to the virtue of patience, but to another virtue, which is not necessarily problematic. It's just that perhaps the person is more compassionate than she is patient, let's say.
Yeah. That's a very nice pushback, and it's pushback I've gotten in other contexts as well. I think I might be wrong, so I'm open to changing my view here. I think a couple things. One, it could be that it's both. Maybe it's not either or. Maybe the person is exhibiting both compassionate behavior and patient behavior. Secondly, I want to say about this kind of case, look, if you're going to carve that out as compassion, if you're going to carve out, other motivations under the heading of justice and other motivations under the heading of other virtues, I wonder what is left for patience. What would patience motivation, specific patience motivation, look like? If it's only like, I wanted to be patient, or I think patience is important, that's the only kind of motivation that counts for the virtue of patience. Motivation that mentions patience explicitly, boy, that's very intellectual. That's very unusual. It's very academic. That's something a philosopher would say. But most people, I don't think, in our minds, okay, I'm going to behave this way in order to be a patient person, or because it's what patience requires. So what I'm trying to find are some motivations that are more common that can give rise to patient behavior. But that also could be described, that behavior could also be described as fitting under another virtue as well. Maybe compassion, maybe fairness, and so forth. So that's my immediate reaction, but I acknowledge that this is a controversial matter.
Right. So another question then, and perhaps later we can come back to this topic, but what is epistemic patience? And I'm saying that we'll come back to this topic because I also want to get into a little bit into the discussion of what distinguishes, if that's a real distinction, moral virtues or ethical virtues from epistemic or intellectual virtues. But let's go with patience now.
Yeah, sure. So I do need to say a little bit for those who are not familiar with this term epistemic. So epistemic is contrasted here with moral. And so another word that's often used for epistemic is intellectual. So intellectual versus moral. Right. So moral has to do typically with interpersonal interactions, so interactions with other people. Epistemic or intellectual has to do more with our thinking and our thought lives.
Right.
and intellectual activities.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there are a couple issues here. One, is there are intellectual virtues in general distinct from moral virtues? We'll come back to that later. You can ask me that later.
Right.
Assuming that the answer is yes, is there a distinct intellectual virtue of patience as opposed to a moral virtue of patience? So just in the case of patience. And I think the answer there is yes. There are two distinct virtues. And so, well, what distinguishes them? Here, I think the answer is their motivation. So it ties into what we were just talking about. The motivation that's going to be distinctive of moral patience is going to be interpersonal motivation, having to do with, the caring and concern for others or what's fair or whatnot. The motivation that's distinctive of epistemic patience is going to be motivation having to do with epistemic matter. So, searching out the truth, gaining wisdom, deepening our understanding, avoiding false beliefs, cultivating knowledge, those kinds of things. Those are epistemic matters. And so an epistemically patient person is not going to rush to a conclusion. They're going to thoroughly investigate the matter for the right reasons. Again, motivation matters. So for the right reasons, because they care about discerning the truth, discovering the truth, because they care about not having false beliefs. Another thing they're going to do is not get frustrated too quickly if their intellectual pursuits don't deliver right away. If their research doesn't pay off right away, their goal is to discover the truth, but it's going slower than expected, they're not going to get frustrated. They're not going to get angry. Again, they're going to be calm for reasons here, though, of caring about the truth and caring about knowledge and other epistemic matters.
So let's get then in this last part of the interview into three more general questions we've already covered on the show: honesty, generosity, and patience. So just in general about the virtues, do you think the virtues are more about something like, let's say, character development, and they are to be more focused on particular traits that particular people possess, so it's about the individual and how they behave and all of that? Or is it more about the good they bring to other people, or both? Or does it depend on the specific virtue we're talking about?
Yeah. So this does dovetail with our earlier discussion of do consequences and outcomes matter only, and is that all that matters, or does motivation and intention matter? And so that this active debate in philosophy, in thinking about virtue in general, which matters more, or maybe is the only thing that matters. My approach is definitely on the side of what you were talking about when it comes to a trait, a part of your character, something you develop, has to do with motivation and intention, and my approach has much less to do with the outcomes.
Okay.
Now, to the extent that I don't even require good outcomes for a trait to be a virtue. It's not even a requirement that the trait produce good outcomes. You could have a intermediate position, a hybrid position, where it both has to have good motivation and has to lead to good outcomes. So that is, just a note that is available as an option. I go to the one extreme, though, with just motivation and your thinking side of things mattering. I'll make one last comment, though. Interesting way you phrased it was, is virtue just a feature of individuals? And this is not a focus of our conversation today, but and it was not a focus of your question, but I think I'll just throw it out there anyway as an observation. There's quite a bit of work in the last few years thinking about whether virtues can be features of organizations, societies, countries, companies, and larger entities than just individuals. So is it appropriate to talk about an honest company or a generous business or a patient, and then, that's maybe a little bit harder, patient society?
Right.
Yeah, and I think the answer there is yes, and we have to unpack what that means, because these are not individuals there, and they don't have minds in any straightforward sense. But it's an interesting extension of that position of individuals having traits to larger entities having virtuous traits as well.
So there's also this distinction we can make, and I'm not sure if you make it in your work or not. Please tell me, between continence and virtue. So tell us about that distinction if you think it's important, and then with it in mind, is it the case that if someone experiences temptation, they cannot be virtuous? I mean, is a virtuous person someone who, when it comes to a particular virtue and the vice that goes associated with it, they never experience or that the temptation related to that vice, or not?
Good. Yeah, great. So this we could do an entire interview on this. I mean, it's a big topic, very interesting and multifaceted. So let me say just a couple brief things. One, the distinction itself, I'll clarify what the distinction is, but the distinction itself is very old. It goes all the way back to ancient Greek philosophy. Aristotle wrote extensively about it. And many followers of Aristotle today still endorse the distinction. I also endorse it as well. And here it is. It's roughly the idea that a virtuous person does not face temptation, whereas a continent person does face temptation, but overcomes it. So they both act the same way, roughly speaking. So from the outside, you can't really tell the difference because they're both acting well. It's a matter of what's going on inside in the head. And for the continent person, there's some kind of struggle going on, the psychological struggle. And they succeed in overcoming it, so you don't give in to temptation. Whereas the virtuous person, they paradigmatically silence any kind of opposing consideration. So they don't have any appeal to them at all. I'll give an example, and then I'll address the other part of the question.
Okay.
So, in an example of this in a familiar context, maybe not moral context, is going to the gym and exercise. So the continent exerciser would realize that that's important, struggle with it though. They say, so tempting to stay on the couch or watch the football game or whatnot, but they still go anyway. The incontinent, which I haven't mentioned yet, the incontinent person realizes it's important too, but they give in to temptation. So they stay on the couch and watch the football game. The virtuous person would never have been tempted to stay on the couch at all. They would have just, hopped up and gone off to work out. Now, that's the framework. How plausible is it? And is it defensible? Well, it's controversial, like all things in this context are. Some philosophers, I think a minority position, but some philosophers have pushed back and said, wait a minute, continence can be very admirable, and we should not think of it as second rate. So let's tackle it directly with what you're asking. Is it the case that if someone experiences some temptation, they cannot be virtuous? And here I want to accept the continence virtue distinction. So I want to accept this framework. And I want to say, look, if most of the time that was going on, most of the time in a variety of situations, there was this struggle going on with temptation, then I would say yes. That person is not qualifying as virtuous. However, and it's hard to draw any boundaries or know where the line should be drawn. However, though, if it happens occasionally, that's fine, because virtue comes in degrees. And once again, as we stressed earlier, it's not a binary here. It's a degreed concept. So you can have a moderately virtuous person or a significantly virtuous person who struggles with temptation on occasion. The perfectly virtuous person, though, if there is such a person, the maximally virtuous person would never struggle with temptation. So.
Okay, but I mean, you mentioned one specific criticism that people can bring to the table that has to do with the fact that, okay, so we tend to think that if someone experiences temptation and they are able to overcome that temptation and not sit to it, then, I mean, there's lots of things to admire there. I mean, it's an admirable thing to not fall for temptation. But perhaps I have another issue that I would like to bring to the table that is somewhat different from that. So is it really realistic for us to expect someone out there to not experience any temptation at all? I mean, is that even possible?
Yeah, no. I mean, I would say, from the armchair, and I mean, it's an empirical question, so we have to, to some extent, study human psychology and look at it. But from the armchair, which I'm sitting in now, or the desk chair, since it's not really a comfy armchair, I would say no. It's not psychologically realistic for human beings to never experience temptation, especially in very tempting situations. But it is realistic for us to make progress in this area. So that in certain areas of my life, I used to be tempted by something and now I no longer am. That can happen. I used to be tempted to, just make up hypothetical examples, cheat on, I don't know, taxes or cheat on a test or something like that. In my younger years. But now, when I encounter those situations, I no longer find that to be tempting. People, in a kind of sexual context can report that about pornography use. And in a dieting context, they could report that about desserts. I used to be really tempted by eating desserts. Now I don't find them very appealing. So I think there can be evolution over time of our characters such that in certain areas with respect to certain situations and objects of pursuit, we no longer find them tempting. But to say that there's nothing out there that would ever tempt us to do wrong, that's probably unrealistic.
But perhaps with your framework in mind, it would be possible for someone to move over time from continence to virtue.
Yes. Now, maybe we have to think about particular virtues. So I think, let's go from continence to generosity. Let's go from continence to patience. Let's go from continence to honesty. So we can definitely move the needle in that direction on particular virtues. And of course, we can move the needle in the other direction too, sadly, and make our character worse. And then, virtue in general is just the compilation of all those particular virtues. So it's possible for someone to move the needle on all the different virtues. And, there are some moral saints and exemplars which have done a great job on at least many virtues. To think, though, that in this life we're going to move the needle on all the virtues to the point where we're going to be fully virtuous or even highly virtuous on all of them, maybe a handful of people have, but that's a really, really hard thing to accomplish.
Okay, so one last question then, and I've already alluded to this question earlier. So, do you think it makes sense to distinguish between moral and epistemic / intellectual virtues?
Yes, I do. So, I think that there's a even broader question in that, which is, does it make sense to distinguish between a variety of kinds of virtues, of which those are two? Yeah. And I think the answer is yes. So those are not the only kinds of virtues. You can also talk about prudential virtues, having to do with what benefits myself in the long run. We can talk about religious virtues. We can talk about civic virtues, which are good for the society. We can talk about aesthetic virtues having to do with beauty. So there are a whole bunch of different clusters or camps of these categories of these virtues. I don't think that's too controversial to say that. And then probably the one that philosophers pay the most attention to these days is that distinction you alluded to, moral versus intellectual. And this is not new. Again, Aristotle had that distinction as well. So the question then, I think the next question becomes, well, how do we make that distinction? On what basis would we distinguish, in general, intellectual virtues from moral virtues?
Right.
And I want to just kind of use what I said about patience and run with it across the board. So, and this is not I should acknowledge my debts here. This is a approach that my former postdoc, Alan Wilson, has developed. And so I'm piggybacking on it. And it's just to say, look, the distinction has to do with motivation. Moral virtues are going to have certain kinds of motives, perhaps having to do with well-being of others, or more interpersonal kinds of motivation. Intellectual virtues are going to have, well, no surprise, more intellectual motivations attached to them. Motivations having to do with epistemic concepts like knowledge, justification, warrant, wisdom, understanding, truth, and the like. And so when you see that cluster motivation in a virtue, you know it's an intellectual virtue. When you see other kinds of motivation, say having to do with alleviating suffering or improving the well-being of others, then you're going to know it's a moral virtue.
And do you think, and this will be really my last question, do you think that there are specific virtues for which we can find different versions of them in the, let's say, the moral and the intellectual realm? So, for example, one example that comes to my mind very easily is courage. So, let's say that someone is courageous because they have the courage to fight back against injustice. That would be moral courage, let's say. And intellectual courage would be something like, okay, so I know that in this particular epistemic community, people are wrong about this particular subject, and even though I might be ostracized, I still put forth my ideas because I think I should do it. I think I should be courageous enough to push back against these wrong ideas that people have. So
Yep.
would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. It's a great example. And I think that it generalizes. So it's not the only example. So I think you can make this similar move for honesty. We have more honesty. That's maybe the more familiar kind. Not lying to you, not misleading you, not cheating you, not stealing from you. But we also have intellectual honesty with respect to the not deceiving ourselves. Self-deception undermines intellectual honesty with respect to how we treat our intellectual pursuits. Not compromising or distorting the facts of what we're investigating. That's another example. Patience works this way too, moral patience and intellectual patience. So I think it would be an interesting question whether it works for every moral virtue, whether there's an intellectual analog for everyone, and I have to kind of go one by one and test that. I haven't really thought through that extensively, but I think there are plenty of examples where that happens. So I think I want to buy your approach.
Okay, great. So, Christian, just before we go, would you like to tell again people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Sure. So I'm on Twitter at Character Gap. So at Character Gap, one word. And that alludes to an earlier book of mine called The Character Gap. And then I'm on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, the usual places. I also have a website, christianbmiller.com.
Okay, great. So, and also just to reference your book again, Honesty, the Philosophy and Psychology of the Neglected Virtue, because I think that many of the more general topics related to virtue that we talked about here today can be found there. So, and it's a great book. So, Christian, thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show, and I hope to have you on somewhere in the future again.
Well, it's always great to be with you. Thank you again for conversation. Wonderful questions, and thank you for all you're doing to help promote these ideas in a larger community.
Thank you. Hi guys, thank you for watching the interview until the end. Please do not forget to share the video, subscribe to the channel, and also leave a like. And if you like what I'm doing, please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. You can find the links in the description box of the interview. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Pererga Larsen, Jerry Mueller, Hans Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Visser, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Force Connolly, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Simon Columbus, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andrea, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londoño Correa, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Elman, Saim Afzal, Adrian Yeagy, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Panos Cortez, Ursula Litske, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Morten Eichland, Dr. Bird, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Mau Maria, Paul Jorge Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Ruth Towell, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Amaury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Pedro Bonilla, Ziegler, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Herringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassis, Tom Roth, the RPMD, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Richard Bowen, Thomas Dobner, Luke Neeson, Chris Story, and Manuel Oliveira. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Hughney, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Vega Giddy, Thomas Turnbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Robert Lewis, and Al Nick Ortiz, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Codrian, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.